In the summer of 1932, at the height of the Great Depression, America's Second Civil War nearly happened. 60,000 angry World War I veterans and their supporters marched on Washington, D.C. to demand payment they'd been promised for the losses they'd suffered during World War I. But when Congress refused to pay, the veterans faced off against the U.S. Army, leading to death, destruction, and violence. This ragtag group of veterans was dubbed the Bonus Army, and this is their story. The Bonus Army occupation of Washington, D.C. is one of the most incredible stories in the USA's history, and it's been mostly forgotten and overlooked with time. It all began during World War I, when the men conscripted to serve their country were divided into two camps. Some fought on the front lines, while others stayed at home to work in factories. After the war, soldiers who fought abroad returned home to great celebrations. But they learned the soldiers who'd stayed home and worked in factories earned up to 10 times as much as the soldiers battling on the front lines, which obviously didn't seem fair at all. The veterans asked to be compensated, so they received pay equal to the soldiers who'd stayed home. And in 1924, Congress granted these veterans adjusted compensation, which would be a payment of around $1,000 per soldier. But there was a catch. The compensation wouldn't be paid until 1945, over 2 decades later. In 1928, after Herbert Hoover was elected, the country fell into the Great Depression and many World War I veterans were left jobless and homeless. A bill was introduced to pay their adjusted compensation immediately instead of 2 decades later, and for many, this adjusted compensation check was basically their only hope. But the bill was resoundingly defeated in the Senate. Veterans everywhere were furious, and at a meeting of jobless veterans in Portland, a veteran named Walter Waters convinced a group of 300 to march on the Capitol and demand payment. This group hopped on a train headed for Washington, and word of this march on Washington started spreading throughout the nation. Veterans everywhere soon decided to join them, taking trains to Washington from all over. Since they were seeking early payment of the bonus they were entitled to, this group descending on the Capitol was referred to as the Bonus Army. By May of 1932, 10,000 Bonus Army members and their supporters had arrived in Washington, D.C., and tens of thousands more were on their way. These tens of thousands of veterans built an enormous city in the mudflats of a Washington, D.C. neighborhood known as Anacostia. It was described as an incredible sight to behold. Streets named after states were arranged, and American flags were everywhere. Most lived in tents and shacks, but some actually built replicas of suburban homes to live in. There was even a library in the center of the makeshift city. But one of the most remarkable things about the Bonus Army encampment was that it was comprised of a great many of African Americans. In World War I, hundreds of thousands of black soldiers had fought for their country, and in the Bonus Army encampment, black veterans and white veterans shared rations, chores, everything. Observers were shocked at how racial lines had disappeared in the Bonus Army encampment. These veterans would march in the streets of Washington and meet with senators during the day, demanding their compensation. And at night, they would enjoy live music performances and boxing matches at their encampment. For nearly 2 months, the Bonus Army lived in this makeshift city, spending every day marching and demanding their payment. It was estimated that the Bonus Army numbered 60,000 people at its height. The veterans were told to go home, but many were penniless and had no homes to return to, and Walter Waters, who had become the Bonus Army's de facto leader, told his men to stay in Washington and continue to fight for their bonus.
I am not advising anybody to go home. We intend to maintain our army in Washington regardless of who goes home.
By mid-July, Washington was a powder keg about to explode. July 16, 1932 was the last day Congress was in session, and thousands of angry veterans surrounded the Capitol. The bonus bill was once again defeated, and congressmen left through back doors and underground tunnels to avoid the protesters. By this point, the Bonus Army had been living in Washington for over 2 months, and President Hoover decided that he'd had enough. He ordered the immediate evacuation of the Bonus Army from downtown Washington. On July 28th, the police tried to evict hundreds of veterans who were living in a row of half-demolished buildings between the White House and the Capitol. Waters told his men to obey peacefully, and initially they did. But then scuffles started breaking out. Some people started throwing bricks at the police, more fights started, and 2 cops fired shots. One veteran was killed, and another was severely injured and eventually died from his injuries. There was fear that this angry mob numbering tens of thousands might riot, so the army was called in. This group included General George Patton and future President Dwight Eisenhower, and the ironic thing is that these soldiers had fought alongside the Bonus Army veterans in the war only years earlier, and now they were faced off against them. Almost 1,000 U.S. Army soldiers with tanks and armored vehicles confronted the Bonus Army. The U.S. Army soldiers wore gas masks and, without warning, hurled gas grenades at the veterans.
And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas, hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States.
The Army soldiers stormed the Anacostia encampment, started demolishing it, and then lit it on fire. The blaze was so massive it lit up the sky throughout the night, and the Bonus Army's living quarters was completely obliterated. Most of the veterans had nowhere to go, they were hopeless and angry, and these feelings were personified by a man named Joe Angelo. During the war, he'd received the Distinguished Service Cross for saving General Patton's life on the battlefield, but became jobless and homeless after returning from the war. He traveled to Washington as part of the Bonus Army, and after their encampment was destroyed, he went to see General Patton. And Patton refused to meet with him. "Take him away," he said. "I don't want to see him." After the destruction of their camp, most Bonus Army members took trains back to where they'd come from to roam the streets, eat in the breadlines, and beg for jobs. But the story does have a happy ending. In 1936, President Roosevelt vetoed the bonus bill yet again, but this time the Senate and the House overrode the veto. The veterans received immediate payment of their compensation, and 4 million veterans got their money. The country was still in the heart of the Great Depression, and the money was a godsend for many. Although it took over a decade to happen, in the end, the veterans and the Bonus Army finally did get paid.
The bonus bill becomes law, and veterans' tab on World War I is paid in full.
Hey, this is Andy with Control-Alt-History. Thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, all that. And definitely check out our other videos if you want to learn more about mysterious deaths from the 1970s and creepy 1980s nightclubs and really bizarre stories from the 1800s and a whole bunch of other interesting stories from our past.